Ladies and gentlemen, this RadeonGames.com video. Regular viewers will know that there are two known Polaris-based Radeon GPUs to be released this year. They are Polaris 11 and Polaris 10, with Vega following next year, that would be 2017. This is also an article, by the way, so do feel free to check it out, it's linked in the video description. Rather counterintuitively, Polaris 11 is actually the lower end of the two cards, and it's also kind of more mysterious too. So we've seen Polaris 10 actually running some games. We saw it actually running Hitman back at Capsaicin, and it was running Hitman at 1440p in DirectX 12 mode at 60 FPS with all the settings at max. And what we've heard through the grapevine is that the game is actually being locked down to 60 FPS. So for all we know, it could be capable of running the game at 62 FPS, or it could be capable of running the game at 600 FPS. We don't really know the actual final results of what the card's really capable of. Polaris 10 though, Polaris 11 though is a little more confusing. Polaris 11 was shown off at the same event to be running 4K VR content passively. Just to clarify, that would be video content. And we also saw a video comparing Polaris 11 to a GTX 950 running Star Wars Battlefront. Now these settings were 1080p, medium, and locked down to once again 60 FPS, and the GTX 950 pulled a rather decent, pretty damn decent 140 watts from the wall with the rest of the system, which was an i7 4790 with 16 gigabytes of RAM, pretty standard configuration. And the Polaris architecture just pulled 86 watts, once again supposedly from the wall, so that's pretty darn good going. We have heard some rumours and configuration information regarding the Polaris 10, and we'll quickly touch on that later on, and it is also in an article as well, which you can check out, which is linked in the article I just mentioned, in case you want to check that out for yourself. But getting to the main crux of the matter, Polaris 11. So compubench has actually a few benchmarks and a full listing of one of the SKUs in the Polaris 11 lineup. We'll get into the SKU listing in just a moment. But this particular card is known as Goose, which has the 67FF extension. Now this card has 16 compute units, and if you remember the basic anatomy of GCN, 16 compute units is timed by 64 because there are 64 shaders, or if you prefer, stream processors per compute unit, which gives us a grand total of 1024 unified cores. Now this particular GPU has a maximum listed clock speed of 1000 megahertz, which gives us a grand total of compute performance of around 2 T-flops, which is pretty darn good. It's slightly above what the PlayStation 4 is capable of, and depending on the price point, it could be a pretty interesting card. Now you may say to yourself, well, okay, so that's the end of it, right? That's Polaris 11. No, not so much, because this is where things get interesting. So, as you are aware, AMD regularly release driver updates for their cards, and just like Nvidia do, and they have started to release driver updates for Linux, which actually have Polaris and Polaris 11 and Polaris 10 notes in them, basically pathways for the driver. Now those particular listings actually have not one, not two, but 6 Polaris 11 cards. Now whether all of those are for customer units, whether they all end up seeing the light of day, we don't know. But this also means that we're not really sure where this particular card, Goose, or 67FF if you prefer, falls in the lineup. It could be the bottom end, it could be the top end, or it could be more likely about the mid-range. So 16 compute units, so where would the high end be? Well, most likely we won't be seeing any more than about 1280. Any less than that, and it wouldn't make sense given the previous lineup of cards, considering that the R9 490 and R9 480/480X, whatever it ends up being called, have around the 2000 shader mark, depending on the GPU we're referring to. It doesn't really make a great deal of sense to then say, well, you know, let's say around the 2000 shader mark, going all the way down to just 1000 shaders. It's too much of a big gulf. That's why there's a good possibility that we're going to see, once again, the regular increments, and it would also make much more sense given AMD's past history, and NVIDIA's past history, to be fair, of the, in AMD's case, the R7/R9, 200 and 300 lineup. So, what else do we know about the card? Well, the GPU is, of course, only as fast as the memory system that's powering it. In this case, we're going to be looking at either 2 or 4 gigabytes of memory. Unfortunately, not exactly sure which, but once again, the lower end models are probably not going to need much more than 2 gigabytes, because let's face it, if you're running a GPU with, just pulling out my butt, 768 shaders, it doesn't matter how efficient it is, it's most likely not going to need much more than 2 gigabytes, because let's face it, are you really going to be able to put the settings up high enough to really use that memory anyway? Probably not. Similarly, for higher end devices, 4 gigabytes of memory is most likely what you want to sell, because it looks good to the customer, and B, with the next generation of GPUs being that much more efficient, there's a good argument that the next generation of games are certainly going to want to use that memory. This is only going to be a 128-bit bus, and we're unsure whether it's going to be GDDR5 or GDDR5X. Most likely 5X would be reserved for just the higher end models, as you could imagine. This is all pretty exciting stuff, and considering that once again we're going to be looking at a process which is made on the with the 14nm FinFET process, we should start seeing massive improvements in power consumption, the number of transistors which you can cram into a certain space, and with that combined with the fact that, of course, the next generation of cards are going to bring things such as improved compression. We should be seeing improved efficiency. AMD, for example, have already mentioned things such as primitive discarding. It should offer quite a healthy boost. So what I'm basically telling you is that 2 T-flops of this particular card could well outperform the performance of, let's say, 2 T-flops of an older GCN card. And I say way outperform, but in reality, of course, it could just be 5 or 10%, or it could be 30%. It probably will depend upon the application, it probably depends upon the game engine, and what's going on in the particular scene. For example, if a scene is heavily constrained with bandwidth, then that could be one consideration. If a scene requires a lot of tessellation, that could be another, or a lot of geometry, that could be another consideration. It all comes down to various, I guess you could say, various usage scenarios. What we do know, however, is that the benchmarks which are being shown at compubench, and obviously it's only one, are not particularly interesting, because it would appear that most likely the card is being run at a very odd scenario. It's most likely it's running at idle speeds, which drastically reduce the performance of the GPU. Obviously, it's not going to be able to rev up to like maximum boost speeds if it's running passively, for sake of argument. We also don't know about the about the situation regarding whether it's engineering samples, whether the clock speeds are final, whether various parts of the driver are fully working, what the state of the BIOS is, just dozens of other little things which can make massive differences in the grand scheme of things. But what it does show us is that, well, the GPUs are here, and they're here to stay. And this does tie in rather nicely to previous rumours that AMD are planning to debut their card at Computex, which is obviously next month, late next month, and also that AMD's R9 490/480 cards are going to be quite monstrous as well. For example, we're looking at around 8 GB of GDDR5X memory, 256 memory bus, and of course a rather healthy number of shaders, around 2300, which is thanks to 36 compute units. Once again though, that does depend upon the Polaris 10 SKU in question. We're not sure quite which one is fitting into where. It's very interesting stuff, because what we're not sure about here is that, yeah, all of these cards are pretty darn impressive, but because of all the efficiency, you can't just take a shader number and then know what is happening, because there could be massive changes in the architecture of the card. For example, how much cache is there, compression. We could be looking at, once again, geometry changes, or various accelerators in the card which have been added. Unfortunately, it's just a little early to know. But I can tell you one thing, it's going to be bloody interesting to actually have a point-to-point comparison, because back when we were reviewing Tonga, it was pretty obvious that, you know, there was quite a big change in the GCN architecture. We definitely saw improvements in tessellation, for example, which was obviously a really good thing. So it's going to be very interesting to see how Polaris, with the shrink down to just 14 nm, and how all of these other things that we've been talking about for so bloody long now, how it all plays out. Finally, I think the card that a lot of folks are going to be wanting to wait for is probably Vega 10. Unfortunately, that's not debuting until next year. That's going to essentially be the replacement for the Fury lineup that we've got right now. So, yeah, that kind of sucks. But either way, Nvidia and AMD are going to be basically duking it out with the 490/ the 1080 series. I guess they're basically going to be aimed at one another. And I have a feeling that comparison-wise, in terms of performance, there's probably not going to be a lot in it. I might be wrong. You know, there could be a major difference, but I have a feeling that both cards, essentially, it's going to be basically trading blows, because that's generally what happens. You might get one that's 5% faster but a little cheaper, or maybe one which is better at, like, you know, The Witcher 4, and another one which is going to be better at, I don't know, you know, the new Grand Theft Auto or something like that. You know how it always goes. It's basically a trade-for-trade comparison, which is fine, and to be honest, I think that's good. I think it's good for the GPU industry. Anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.